I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, welcoming you to a very special Uruguay Wine series. Specially commissioned by Uruguay Wine for your listening pleasure. Across these two episodes recorded in March 2023, we'll be exploring the modern Uruguay winemaking scene, first in the company of three world-renowned flying winemakers, and in the second part offering coverage to the recent Uruguay Wine in London tasting held at 67 Pall Mall. Without doubt reflecting the most up-to-date realities of winemaking in Uruguay. Make sure you're subscribed to be alerted when future episodes go live. We kick things off today in the company of the three flying winemakers, Hans Vinding Diers, Duncan Killiner, and Paul Hobbs. Paul kicks things off, introducing us to Uruguay geography and geology, before Hans gives us a deep dive into climate and climate change, followed by Duncan's take on culture and modernization in the country, before each of the three take us in turn into their realizations gained by making wine in this exciting region, touching on many of the facets that make the country a hidden gem in South America, including, of course, the emblematic grape Tannat, but also focusing on other important white varietals, such as Albarino, getting into examples of intelligent viticulture, the local market, getting into how all three were welcomed by local winemaking communities and families, before closing on how well situated Uruguay is to face the future challenges posed by climate change. Enjoy.
Uruguay, of course, is a relatively small country, maybe 600 miles north to south, with two countries bordering it, Brazil to the north and Argentina to the west. And basically, it's except for the Brazilian border, it's surrounded by water. So you have the Atlantic to the east, the Rio de la Plata, which is a major, world's widest river, as a matter of fact, fed by the Rio Uruguay, which is the border between Argentina, forms the border between Argentina and Uruguay. So there's a lot of water, and it's a relatively low elevation country. I think somewhere maybe 500 meters, a little over 500 meters is the tallest mountain, if you can call it a mountain. So it's mostly the area where viticulture exists is mostly near the Rio de la Plata to the southern part of the country. Of course, there's a little bit of everything scattered around. So you can go all the way up to the department of Rivera, which is right on the Brazilian border. And you'll find viticulture there in the center of the country in Durazno. And of course, along the Atlantic, which is kind of a newer development in Garzón, above Maldonado and so on. I first came to Uruguay in 1992 for the Centro de Bodegueros on a project that was sponsored by the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB. And so my first experience was for 3 years of helping build their wine industry. And I was not the commercial side of that equation. I mostly worked on viticulture and winemaking. And it was my first opportunity to kind of get a sense of, well, what does it translate? In my mind, Bordeaux has some significant waterways. It has a major ocean as well, the same one, Atlantic. And but its soils are very different than from Bordeaux. So I would say in that sense, and even climatically, there's quite a difference from Bordeaux. Galicia, some people have compared it, but in my experience with Galicia, is much more mountainous. And it has probably more severe weather, meaning that it'll snow there and so on and so forth. And I've not yet seen it snow in Uruguay. So it's its own thing, in a way, which is beautiful. I mean, maybe I'm just too particular about, terroir selection. It's always great to make it analogous to something, but I don't really know. What I love about it is it's quite distinctive and unique.
Yeah, I certainly think there's something there when, you know, the tendency is to want to compare, I think, people and places and foods and always make them more familiar to people. But I think, you know, there is something there when there's a challenge, when you're kind of forced really to get into nuance and to actually describe it as its own thing, which I think is accurate. And I think what would really kind of flow well from there is maybe to talk a little bit to the geology, because I think it's come up a number of times really that you know, Uruguay has these sort of rolling hills and often, you know, paint this kind of quite bucolic image of you know, somewhere that's so green and kind of so lush. So I think it would be helpful to get a sense of kind of what's going on underneath that, and maybe, you know, some of the forces that have actually shaped that landscape.
Yeah, in some ways, when I think about, Lawrence, the topography, the rolling hills, the pasture lands, this bucolic, sort of like Ireland green, and you know, it just feels, you know, safe and welcoming and warm. You know, and the people are very much like that as well. I think there's, and also with respect to the geology, there's quite a diversity, but the areas where I find that, you know, you have a true terroir, in other words, a place where truly great wines could be made, are very small pockets that are located here and there, but they're very diverse in terms of soils. For example, if you're out in Garzón, which is one of the newer regions that we sort of elucidated not more than 20 years ago, really, there wasn't really much going on out there other than pasture land. And so I think the Dacus family were among the first to kind of pioneer that region. There, the soils are like decomposed granite. In some ways, they're similar to the soils you'd find in Apalta, Chile, for example, at Casa La Apostol, in that region near Santa Cruz. And they drain extremely well. And other soils, for example, near Montevideo, the capital city, just north of Montevideo and Canelones area, is very clay and heavy soils. And they, if you don't get much rain, then they crack and they give good aeration. And, you know, you might look at that and say, well, that's not really ideal, but somehow Tannat in particular seems to thrive on that kind of site and builds a lot of energy into the wines. And then you have granitic soils, just, you know, very rocky, and other areas that are really red. And so you've got quite a diversity to work with. And that's one of the things that, of course, I enjoy, you know, even if our plantations are extremely small, because we're also looking for well-drained sites, which means basically we're looking for areas that are convex in shape. So, and they can be facing west or south, maybe not, you know, either toward the sun, away from the sun. That's not quite as important because we do get quite a lot of sun there. And then, of course, climatically speaking, each of these sites is different as well. So depending on your proximity to the ocean or to the river, the Rio de la Plata has a lot to do with the humidity in the atmosphere, the rainfall, that kind of thing. So, and that's been fun because, you know, mainly I've been working with Tannat, but the white varieties are exceptional as well. There's a lot of freshness and brightness to the fruit, good acidity. They get nice cold nights. And I would say in the last 10 years, climate change has had a large shift. I mean, it used to rain much more during harvest, and now it's sometimes drier than Mendoza. So it's that shift has been very interesting and I think beneficial to the viticulture of that region. This is a very kind of a secure economic country. It's a safe country. People are well educated. It's family oriented. So I think this is an amazing place to visit. It's just, there's a tranquility and a beauty to and I think that comes through in the wines. I mean, I do believe that when we talk about terroir, it's more than just climate and soil and that kind of, and topography. I mean, I think that it's man and nature kind of coming together, and wine is about that. And so I think you see a reflection of a place that, well, really is one of the finest places on the planet, I think, to possibly live. I mean, it's really quite idyllic in that sense. And what I love, their cuisine. It's all healthy. It's very thoughtful. There's a lot of passion, and what I love about what we're doing in the wine space is essentially really exploring more extreme locations and pushing the boundaries of what can be done. And there's a handful of people now. Some of them are very small, some of them are larger, but I think the whole of viticulture and winemaking in Uruguay is advancing at a rate that's quite impressive. And they're really shaking it up, I guess is what I want to say. And I think it's important to pay attention to what they're doing.
So, having been given an intro to the geography and geology of Uruguay by Paul, Hans will now give us an intro to the Uruguay grape-growing climate, how this climate is changing, as well as some fascinating facts about how the Atlantic influence and soil pH combine to allow Uruguay to produce wines of stunning freshness.
Usually you would have wet winters, cold, damp, wet winters. It would feel cold because of the humidity, but it's not freezing temperatures. They're not like other places. And in the spring, it's usually warm. Also, could be showery. Very sort of irregular. Weather. Summer can be very hot. You could reach the 35, even 40 degrees sometimes. And then autumn, usually, the end of summer, autumn, usually you could get, or it would be dry or it would be wet. Most of the time it's wet again, so you could definitely feel the maritime influence in Uruguay, especially all the vineyards are really, concentrated on the coastline. So, between Montevideo and Brazil, they're all mainly on the coastline. And it's a typical maritime influenced region, area. And there are two main areas today. There's a place called Canelones, which is one of the original, the original place of where the wine sort of appeared in Uruguay. And nowadays you have this another area which is further up northeast, which is called Maldonado, and that is that's much more maritime because Canelones is right next to the estuary of the Rio de la Plata, so it's a river. Kind of a huge river. The Rio de la Plata is very big. It's kind of more estuary, whereas Maldonado is more Atlantic. It's the actual ocean. So it's basically where the ocean meets the river, which would be Canelones and Montevideo, and then you go further northeast, and then you get the Atlantic. So they're different regions. They're different microclimates, and which makes it interesting because they're making different styles of wine, because of the soils, because of where they're located. It's not like you can decide one day to another, let's go organic, without changing your ways of working and machinery and whatnot. So there is a movement, the CREA group, which is an association of all the viticulturists together, who then have debates and they do investigations, et cetera, and now they come up with this sustainability certificate that basically, it's basic, but it's a start. It's a beginning to start to try and treat nature with a little bit kinder. It's more a question about being conscious about what's going on than being blinded, blindsided. So I find that there is some movements going on. We definitely, in the winery I'm with, we definitely adhering to that. Because I think, why? I mean, if the Swiss and the Austrians and the Germans can do organic, so then so could Uruguay, I mean, to me, that is a no-brainer.
Yeah.
But, it takes time.
Yeah.
It takes time for people to understand. There's a movement towards that, and I think that's very positive. What also differentiates, I think, Uruguay from Argentina and from Chile, it's a Atlantic-influenced place, whereas Argentina, most of its vineyards are continental, and Chile is Pacific-influenced grapes. I think it's the beginning of a new era for Uruguay. Absolutely. I'm convinced about that because the following. We happen to have, I can really talk mainly about where we are, on Maldonado, which is 10 minutes from the sea, more or less, 10 kilometers. We have an amazing pHs, very good pHs, very low pHs in a hot country, right? And that's unusual. And so it means you have natural acidities and very good ones and a very good balance between pH and acidity. And I think that is what interests me the most, because it means that you don't need to correct the wines. You don't need to play around too much with them. They can actually express themselves without too much panic in the cellar, let's say, or overreaction.
Next, let's hand things over to Duncan, who will explore the modernization in Uruguay winemaking and how counterintuitively this may be bringing back styles that are actually more expressive of terroir and site.
And what's sort of happening in the last 5 to 10 years is a big modernization of Uruguay. There's a lot of investment by the government and the national bodies and institute to produce a better quality wines. And so people were encouraged to invest in their vineyards, produce lower yielding vines and higher quality wines, and not concentrate so much on the traditional markets where you can see in their wines of demi-juanas. Now people bottle all their wines. There's a huge tourist industry here in Uruguay because people come to the beach. There's a lot of people from Brazil. And as people have been educated about wines, so the market has got more interesting wines. We've developed a whole different range of wines. And as we were saying before, Uruguay's, let's say, a humid climate, it's also like a bit like Galicia. Very humid. And fortunately, Uruguay has started the last 5 to 10 years planting lots of Albarino. And so the new things that are coming out of Uruguay are very food-based premises. People are looking for very natural, let's say, return to the land. And one of the things that you find in Uruguay is that most of the wineries are very small family-owned businesses. So one of the amazing things that we see in Uruguay is that you can actually meet the winery owner. You can go and visit the winery, taste all their wines, have lunch, and you can have lunch with the winery owner, which is very rare in a modern sense of winery because most wineries are so big. Uruguay is still very small, and a lot of these wineries are family businesses who are really going back to the original winemaking of their grandparents, and this is where we make the wine from this land. So that's very terroir driven. It's very family focused. So basically we have a lot of wines that have a lot of different styles. And so it's very hard to pigeonhole Uruguay as, oh my goodness, it's Malbec or it's Carmener. The biggest produced grape in Uruguay is obviously Tannat, but there's now 100 different styles of Tannat, from sparkling Tannat to carbonic maceration like a Gamay to very big oaky styles. So it's quite difficult to actually pigeonhole it anywhere. And now people are planting right above the sea. There's new plantations of Albarino right above the water, Pinot Noir, Riesling, very different sort of very food-derived varieties where people are setting up little sort of wineries and restaurants and visitor places. So you can come and stay and taste all these different wines. And there's a big investment in the east of Uruguay. Traditionally, Uruguay was all around the capital, Montevideo, in Canelones, it's called. And now people are moving out to the east because we have these very rocky granite soils. So we're planting on the inclines and the foothills of the mountains here. We don't have it's not a huge cordillera. We don't have the Andes Mountains in Uruguay. It's quite low. But because we have these rolling hills and different microclimates, we're getting a lot of different grape styles. So and a lot of the new generation of winemakers are doing natural wines. So people are really going back to unsulfited wines, unfiltered wines, different styles of a much younger generation. So suddenly there's a whole new wave of winemaking here.
So then, having set the scene for their take on Uruguay from a fairly high level, what each of the three will do in the remainder of the episode is really take us into their experiences, of course referencing their practical experience with Tannat and other grape varieties on the ground, but also now with the benefit of hindsight, looking at what changes have been made over that time in viticulture, as well as what has been demanded by the market, and how well Uruguay has reacted.
Yeah, it seems that, Tannat is originally, as you know, from southwest France, near the Pyrenees. And I've spent a lot of time, I have a winery in Cahors, France, which is a bit to the north, near Toulouse. So this area is near the Basque Country, and it's said that in the 1870s, roughly, with Basque immigrants brought the variety. And the name of Tannat, essentially, I think, is given to the variety because of its tannic nature and structure. And one of the things is like, well, how can you make a Tannat that you don't need to wait 20 years to drink? And that's been one of the challenges. I think I'm not that familiar from the wines of its homeland in the Mediterranean, but I do know that one of the things we've been focused on is how do you soften the wine? And the Uruguayan climate and soils, there's a lot to do with extraction and how it's grown, but also are very conducive to just developing a nice, sweet, ripe tannin. And so I think that's just a function of the place, to some extent, already helping us get to where we want to go. Because otherwise, they're so chewy and so structured and firm that it can be difficult to drink unless you've got a lot of time in your saddle, so to speak. But, so I think there's something to say about just this warm climate, but cold nights. And again, I don't really have the knowledge of its homeland, but I do think these are softer style. Uruguayan Tannats are a bit softer in style and more approachable, more accessible. We essentially, there's a lot to do with viticulture and how it's grown. And we take great pains to make sure, because the cluster is a fairly large, if you look at Cabernet, for example, the berry size and cluster size of Tannat quite a bit significantly larger than Cabernet Sauvignon, as an example. And so if you get a couple of big clusters close to each other, you're not getting the air movement and sunlight around the fruit to really fully, properly ripen the berries. And so we've taken tremendous pains to separate all the clusters and do very careful thinning during the growing season after set, so that each cluster has its own space, essentially. And so there's a separation process that we make and a thinning process that occurs. And we found that truly makes a difference in getting the tannins to the level of ripeness that softens them and sweetens up that structural component, softens it and makes it more approachable. And then, of course, what you do in the winery, and just more a gentle extraction approach to the variety brings out a lot of the bright fruit, blackberry, dark cherry notes, and all the energy that's there, but leaves sometimes some of the harsher, more aggressive tannins behind. So that way you can I consider it like analogous to the Japanese tea ceremony where, we pay a lot of attention to the temperature, time of infusion. And so these are really critical and thought-provoking. How much oxygen do you give during fermentation? How much extraction are you going to go after? How long of maceration? So we've been studying all those questions. And of course, there's no single answer to any particular vintage or to any particular site. And there's different clones of Tannat, as you can imagine, as well. So that just adds more layers of complexity, but also it makes it more like a three-dimensional chess game as well.
This is it. And I think, I'm happy that I do have a lot of listeners who are MW students, who are diploma students, and I always feel as though there are, so many different rabbit holes, really, that I guess we could go down and we could really kind of delve into. But sometimes it's helpful to not be able to go down all of those. But I think that one of the points that is kind of front of mind is actually then thinking about the market, because you've been making wines in various parts of the world over, I think, a period of change, really, in terms of what the consumer is looking for and what they're expecting, perhaps, from a Uruguayan wine, for example. Something that, again, really kind of demonstrates that sense of place and actually translates through, and maybe the things that you've spoken about there in terms of how the clusters are treated and how the wines are treated through their élevage and in the cellar as well. I think what I'm picking up is that you've really kind of moved in step really with the market in terms of giving them something that is kind of uniquely Uruguayan from your Uruguayan portfolio.
Very much. What's interesting is, of course, in all this, we want to elevate the distinction of terroir of various regions of Uruguay. But most people outside of Uruguay don't really know much about Uruguay, let alone these micro regions. So if you're in the market, and I'll just use the U.S. as an example, the first thing is to help build awareness that it's sort of like, as you mentioned earlier, a hidden gem. And once people sort of try Uruguayan wine, and particularly if they've been to Uruguay as well, you put the combination together and then they become fans because the people are so well educated and so warm and they give you their time and so on. So I think, getting wines introduced into the market, the wines have to be approachable. And they can be well structured with good tension, but they can't be malicious. And in terms of tannin, and so it sort of goes back to making wines that are really fresh, vibrant, full of energy, lively, and that's something that's actually Uruguay excels, I would say, in that producing wines of that ilk, but they've only been doing it at a high level, I would say, for the last 10 to 15 years. 30 years ago, they didn't have, they weren't ready, but they made huge advancements now, and I think people are well served to kind of pay attention to what's going on there for that reason. So there's been a lot of investment in improving, vineyard plantings as well as infrastructure in the wineries. At any rate, going back to the market question, I think those things have cleaned up the wines. Because if people are thinking, the old Uruguay wines, these are very different from wines of 20 years ago.
Yeah,
they're clean and fresh and bright and vibrant, and they have depth and character. So there's much more sophistication to the wines. They're far more elegant in the last 10 or 15 years. You've got a population of a little over 3 million people, so they're not going to drink all their production. And if you're putting in millions of dollars into an investment there, well, you've got to be able to develop a market for the wines that you're going to produce that's outside of the local market.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of good work that's been done, and by local people as well as foreign companies or individuals that have come in and really believed in Uruguay. I think that's very exciting.
I know that there's a lot of talk around climate change, and I know there's also a lot of talk that Uruguay itself does actually experience quite a lot of vintage variation as well, as is perhaps not always seen in some of its neighbors. And I think the question there is really around the grape growing, really, and how can that be done, if you like, more sustainably and more thoughtfully with regards to inputs. If actually, by the sounds of things, there's actually quite a lot of variability that one may encounter vintage to vintage. Yeah,
Uruguay is an area, I mean, your farming there is sort of like, well, parts of France or Europe. You're gonna see massive shifts in climate from one vintage to the next. And, well, I mean, we're sort of blessed with a lot more knowledge today than we did have, and also the technology that we have to even track weather and to basically, so you put all that together, the advancements in farming, the technology and the tools that we have to work with allow us to optimize each vintage situation, even if it's a really wet year, and also we're doing the handwork that's necessary, because sometimes, the thing you really need to do is it's hand labor, it's hand work, it's leaf removal. How much is too much? How little is too little? And of course, that has to be tailored to the particular vintage. But we have ways to both. You still have to walk the vineyard. I think there's no better way to know what is needed than carefully observing your vines during the growing season. But then and a lot of what we can do, even in wetter climates today, can be farmed organically, which would have been kind of deemed impossible and irresponsible not that many years ago. So just the learnings that we've had in the last 20 years have upped the game significantly in the way how fine wine grapes are grown. And we sort of like skate or dance with the climate, depending on if it's really warm and dry. Well, we have solutions for it, because that's the opposite. If it's too dry or too hot, you can stress the vines from water stress, heat stress. On the other side, you can have another vintage. And I've even seen this in New York, for example, where one year is drought, the next, and we see this in Cahors and more around the world, where you see the extreme weather, like it is been in California lately. It's just been raining and raining and raining after 5 years of drought. Now California has turned, we have lakes where we never knew there were lakes. So these kind of things, however, I don't feel threaten us. I think we kind of, we love actually working with that diversity, and the quality that can be made now is almost every vintage can be good.
Viticulture is the only way you can actually, intelligent viticulture and observant viticulture is the only way we can tackle the weather patterns. But like I said, it's nothing new. But, you just have to adapt. And there's no other way. I mean, like you said, you can't take a day off or a year off. So, of course, one goes adapting his ways of pruning, or ways of trellising, ways of working your vineyards. I mean, at one stage, 10 years ago, you wouldn't have grass among the vineyard. Now you do. So you wouldn't have cover crops, but now you do. So, it's a dynamic process, and it's perpetual. It just doesn't stop. So the future belongs to the ones who actually do good viticulture. The other ones, I think they might stay back in the yard. But it definitely if you venture into this world of winemaking, you have to be quite resilient. You have to be very resilient, and you have to be ready for all kinds of situations. But you have to learn to adapt. It's very, very important. And I think that's what's happening in Uruguay. They're definitely learning as we speak. It just made sense for us to make a Tanat that was less extracted, with not too much oak treatments or long aging. And whereas there's another face of Tanat which is robust, quite powerful, like you say, gastronomical wines with quite a little bit of barrique, but they seem to age really well. So that's one type of Tanat that you would keep for keeps. The more traditional one. Then there's the one that we tried to do, which is it's more mineral, fresh, very little intervention. So it really is the terroir that speaks and not much more. Because maybe, there could be a market developed with a new vision or a new era of Tanat. And I think that is welcomed, because, you can't have everything all one style and a little bit outdated. So it's very exciting. It is a very exciting moment in Uruguay. Then, and then we have other varietals that are coming in play. There's one winery, Bosa, who originally were the first ones to bring in Alvarinho, a grape that you could find in Galicia as well as in Portugal, And it's very maritime. It thrives on maritime climates. And it did very well for them. And nowadays, a lot of people have Alvarinho planted. And it's one of those grapes that can handle the weather. It can handle rain. It can handle heat, and it's very versatile. And it seems to have found a happy place in Uruguay. And it's very varietal, as in Spain or Portugal, but it has its own signature, which is very, very interesting, because there are not so many Alvarinhos in the world, or Alvarinho growing countries. And I think Uruguay really has a chance with that varietal. I'm betting on Alvarinho as another flagship alongside Tanat for Uruguay. And in fact, I think Uruguay is very interesting when it comes to fresh wines, white wines, rosé, a light Tanat maybe even. I think there's something to do there. And I think the world is also, there's a certain comeback to white wines and, fresher mineral beverages. So, which makes sense. No, I mean, if the climate is hot, you're not going to want a very heavy wine. It just makes sense. There's another point, Lawrence, which is very interesting. The prices of Uruguayan wine. A very good price, quality price. Very good. Very interesting. You can get really good wines at a very good price. Because as Uruguay is really starting to make some noise, they can't come out with crazy prices, or like Argentina can, or Chile already doing. I think there's much more conservative on those lines. So, and also the other interesting thing is that the quantities are not extremely high, because it's a small place. They don't make vast amounts of wine. A lot of wine is actually drunk in Uruguay, and maybe Brazil is probably its best client, outside of Uruguay. So there are some gems to be discovered without a doubt. And if I'm there, there's a reason.
Yeah.
I'm busy enough, so if I'm there, there's a very good reason, and it's an exciting place, to be. I think when you find places that are being born, it's always fun. Basically, yeah, there are the old families that are fourth generation producers who, definitely have their wineries going. And if you think about it, if they survive 4 generations, well, then they're doing something right. And then you get the newcomers, a bit like us, and some others who have a different view on things, and I think it's very interesting that, this mix or conversion of old culture of Uruguayan families and the new scene is definitely creating some action. So I think on that context, it's very exciting. It's in a very exciting moment to be there.
One of the issues for all producers is climate change. Now, climate change for us, it just really brings much more strong weather events. Whereas when it rains, it really rains, or we can get hail or wind. Things that were unheard of 10 years ago are now much more common events. So one of the issues is, and obviously moments where there's no water. So one of the issues, Uruguay traditionally has a lot of water. We've just had almost 4 months without rain, as they had in the Po in Italy. And a lot of these places that traditionally had water suddenly don't have water. And we're going, okay, maybe we need to irrigate. Is that sustainable? Shall we change the way we're thinking about our conduction systems of the vine, our trellising? And so what a lot of the people have gone to in these new plantings is hillside plantings. So when we've gone to these areas out the east, where I am now in Punta del Este and Maldonado, we've gone looking for these areas which are rocky soils, which are on an incline, so we get drainage, we get wind, we don't get frost, because now in Uruguay we're getting frosts. We've never had frosts before. And so there's a great, let's say, diversity in the weather. You can hear it now. It's just starting to get windy here, and that's happening everywhere. So now we're trying to feed these much more sustainable plantations where we can integrate everything we do, and we try to think ahead. Okay, if it's going to get warmer, if it's going to rain more, if it's going to rain less, how do we integrate in these soil sites and these areas which are very rocky, which are not really being used for a lot of farming because they're not very productive.
A huge thanks to today's guest flying winemakers, Hans Vinding Diers, Duncan Killiner and Paul Hobbs. As I'm sure you'll agree, an absolutely fascinating exploration of Uruguay in the company of 3 renowned winemakers, making wine in multiple countries and in multiple hemispheres, who I think did a great job of positioning just what it is that make Uruguay unique, both from a terroir perspective, but also from a cultural perspective. Each, I feel, having a very strong connection to the people and place. Please do help to amplify this landmark episode and the series by sharing the direct link, which is interpretingwine.com/524, and you can find links to both of the series episodes below. Next time on the Interpreting Wine Uruguay special series, we'll be changing gears and shifting over to London with coverage of the Uruguay Wine in London tasting recently held at 67 Pall Mall. This episode features several of the Uruguay winemakers who presented their wines at the tasting, and I'll also be talking with Amanda Barnes, author of the South America Wine Guide, who was the host of the tasting at 67 Pall Mall. Make sure you're subscribed to be alerted when the episode goes live. See you then.